Perhaps the most haunting and uncomfortable question that we are going to be rolling around in our minds with for the next few months will be this question: who sinned? Who sinned? Who is sinning? What sin caused the coronavirus? Is this the judgment of God? Are this particular sins of some people, political, religious, medical, making this problem worse? Are they making it better? Who sinned? Right away, predictably, when this thing hit, certain news organizations, certain pastors jumped right on this, and I guess you can count me in that group right now. Is the coronavirus a judgment from God? Now, Dr. Robert Jeffress he's a pastor of a very large church in Texas. He's been an outspoken friend of this particular administration. And so right away he did a piece on this question, and news organizations predictably jumped on him. And I expect that if I had posted something on Facebook, I would have seen the usual dynamics play out. Is this the judgment of God? Is this not the judgment of God? I think the better question is, what do we mean by God in that sentence? Now, there are a lot of long-time answers, and actually the first thing that came up in Google, at least in my search, because I know Google adjusts searches by people, was actually Tim Keller, who had an interview on Fox News Radio, and there's a piece there, and I'll put the link below along with the other links. Noted theologian and best-selling author Dr. Timothy Keller says the answer is nuanced, which is not usually what anyone wants to hear. Some Christians jump up and say, yes, this is the judgment of God, and they will tell you exactly what it's the judgment of God for. And unfortunately and ironically, it will align usually with their ideas of what needs to be judged. Other Christians will jump up and say, no, it's not the judgment of God. God is nice and kind, and if God had his way, this wouldn't help. This wouldn't be happening. But then that raises questions about, well, then is God unable to stop this? And what are we talking about with respect to this God? Again, I recommend Tim Keller's Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering. I think it's his best book. It's written a few years ago, and I'll put the link to it down in the notes. When I visited Tim Keller in his home in 2006, I remember going up to his apartment in New York City with a group of other pastors and being asked, which now is reminiscent of what many of us are doing now, to wash our hands because his wife was struggling with some particular illnesses and her immune system was suppressed, and so we washed our hands and took off our feet so that we wouldn't bring our germs into the apartment. And so the kind of risk that many of us are living with now, that many of you are dealing with in terms of your own health, is something that the Kellers have lived with for a long time. And so Tim Keller's nuanced answer to, is this a judgment of God? Yes and no. And again, this has been the standard Christian answer for a very long time. And it's not an answer that many particularly like. Now, the reason I raise it and asked it this question, who sinned, is because this week, the lectionary, churches often use a common lectionary, particularly in certain liturgical seasons of the calendar. The lectionary gospel text comes from John 9, where this particular question gets raised in a very individual manner. As he went along, he saw a blind man from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? That simply was the expectation of the people, that someone sinned to cause this into being. Now, before you get too pent up with ideas about this, note that someone born blind, let's say in India, people would have likely imagined that, well, this person had committed some sin in a previous lifetime. It's not the worldview of the Jews, but they believed that a problem from birth, a lack of shalom, a lack of what we should be able to expect of a healthy human being was deficient, that deficiency must have been caused by a moral failure. Now, pay attention to Jesus' answer here, because it is actually simple, but as with many things with Jesus, very nuanced and very complex the deeper you go with it. Jesus says, neither this man nor his parents sinned. Now, pause. Are you saying this man and his parents don't sin? No, that's not what Jesus was saying. Are you saying this man and his parents never sinned? No, that's not what Jesus is saying. What Jesus is drawing attention to is our habit to draw the connection between a particular shortcoming or situation of illness or pain or tragedy with a particular sin. That is what Jesus is saying. Nope, not going to do that here. But then look at what he finally does go with. But this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Oh, so he's lived his whole life blind, so he could be a sermon illustration for Jesus? Probably a lot of us would say, that's why doesn't God go do an illustration on someone else? And a point I've made in many of my pieces. The whole nation of Israel could say, why doesn't God choose someone else? Because it seems when God chooses someone for special service or special revelation or apocalyptic revelation, please choose someone else. I'd like my life, or at least my expectations of my life, undisturbed, please. But Jesus goes there. He does. I thought Jesus was supposed to be nice. No, Jesus is not always nice. There's a big difference between nice and good. When you go to the doctor, a good doctor will probably say things to you that are not nice if you need to hear them. Jesus is good. He can be nice. He can be kind, but he is good. It's a bigger category. So again, neither this man nor his parents sinned. No, you don't play that game. But yes, God is involved with his blindness. Well, what do you mean by God? Well, in the Gospel of John, there's a previous healing story, and if you want to see that story, I made a little playlist. This treatment of John 5 got cut off by the coronavirus and having to close down church, and so I'm still figuring out how to get the Sunday school class up and running. I've got a lot of ideas about how to do it. But in that passage, Jesus picks out a man who was by a pool waiting to be healed, and he had been there 38 years. And Jesus asked him, do you want to be healed? And you'd think that's a stupid question. Well, probably not really. And then, similar to this, Jesus kind of pops in later on the man, and Jesus found him at the temple and said to him, see, you are well again. Stop sinning or something worse may happen to you. Jesus just in chapter 9 says, well, between this man, you can't blame him or his parents, but that God's glory would be revealed through him. Here in chapter 5, Jesus says, stop sinning or something worse may happen to you. So Jesus isn't willing to disconnect sin from tragedy, but he's also not willing to play this easy, facile game of, oh, this particular tragedy happened to me because of this particular sin. Those are two different questions, and we have to keep those things in mind, and we're going to see that. And connecting sin with tragedy doesn't come from nothing. In fact, if you read the Bible, you'll find it's all over the plague. Just pick up a Bible dictionary and look up plague or pestilence, and you'll get a list of places in the Old Testament where they are connected. Look at the 10 plagues against Egypt. Now, some of them are plagues or pestilence, kind of like the pandemic we're suffering today. Others were other things. There were the rats and the tumors in among the Philistines that Jonathan Peugeot just made a video about. There was the judgment that fell on David for the sin he committed against Bathsheba and Uriah, and that was a plague. And so, in fact, you find in the Old Testament, it's almost always assumed that plagues are part of the judgment of God sent to individuals, families, and nations. So You can't disconnect that. And again, we want to, but you also can't play the game of, well, there was just an earthquake in Salt Lake City, and the statue of the angel Moroni on top of the Mormon temple was damaged in the earthquake. Now, it would be very easy to jump on that and say, aha. Yeah, but I'm sure there are a lot of other things damaged in the earthquake. I had a picture of a fridge opening and food on the floor. Did the food fall on the floor because of a particular sin in that household? You have to be very careful with that game. But Jesus doesn't say that game is completely invalid either. And in fact, many of us might look at circumstances in our lives and draw connections between whatever you call sin. And again, my perspective is that everybody has their own definition of sin. They might not use the word, but everybody plays the game of morality, and moral judgments are like human noses. They're pretty much everybody has one. And we all find deficits in each other. And when someone does something or some catastrophe befalls someone and it's connected to some moral failure, we instinctively jump forward and say, aha! Yeah, but that doesn't involve God. And again, what do we mean by God? And yes, I'm going to get into God number 1 and God number 2 in this video. Now, the common approach to this you'll find in Yuval Harari's book, Homo Deus, which is the subtraction story, which says, well, we used to believe that things were caused by agents, and we no longer believe that. So we used to believe that plagues and pandemics and earthquake. Now, it's really interesting in Yuval Harari, he knows his Bible. He's Hebrew in background. And when he lists the sword and famine and plague, you will find that triplet often in the Old Testament, because that triplet is common there. Now, pay attention. You might say famine. Was famine never connected to human beings? Well, often it is. Is plague or pestilence never connected to human beings and human behavior? Well, often it is. Well, how about war? Well, always it is. So, in other words, this line we like to draw between natural and unnatural calamities, that line is a lot fuzzier. And an agency gets involved. Yeah, just read what Harari says. At the dawn of the third millennium, humanity wakes up stretching its limbs and rubbing its eyes. Remnants of some awful nightmare are still drifting along the mind. Well, that nightmare became a whole lot real. In some places of the world, in Italy right now, might be coming to the United States. There was something like barbed wire, huge mushroom clouds. Oh, well, it was just a bad dream. Going to the bathroom, humanity washes its face, examines its wrinkles in the mirror, makes a cup of coffee, and opens the diary. Let's see what's on the agenda today. For thousands of years, the answer to this question remained unchanged. The same three problems preoccupied the people of the 20th century China, of medieval India, of ancient Egypt. Famine, plague, and war were always at the top of the list. Why do we go to the grocery store and stockpile food? Well, this has been built into us for a long time. For generation after generations, humans have prayed to every god, angel, and saint, and have invented countless tools, institutions, and social systems. But they continued to die in their millions from starvation, epidemics, and violence. Many thinkers and prophets concluded that famine, plague, and war must be an integral part of God's cosmic plan, or of our perfect nature, and nothing short of the end of time would free us from them. Yeah, that's a very Christian approach. Yet at the dawn of the third millennium, humanity wakes up to an amazing realization. Most people rarely think about it, but in the last few decades, we have managed to rein in famine, plague, and war. Well, apparently not as reined in as we thought. Of course, these problems have not been completely solved, but they have been transformed from incomprehensible and uncontrollable forces. Well, right now, they're seeming pretty incomprehensible and uncontrollable. Now, a lot of this has to do with the rise of deism, and deism is a very big subject, but I'm going to reduce it quite a bit here and talk about one particular aspect of it. That, well, here's the Google definition: belief in the existence of a supreme being, specifically of a creator, who does not intervene in the universe. And right there you have what's at the heart of deism, that there's a creator and the universe, and they're separated from each other. Now, the relationship between the creator and the universe in Christianity, inherited from Judaism, is very nuanced and complex. And this is illustrated by this little worldview model that I pulled off the internet from a lecture given at Messiah College. Judeo-Christian perspective: God is transcendent and immanent, which means the relationship between God and the universe is very tight. In deism, God is transcendent, he's out there, but he's not immanent. And that's where you get, well, no interventionist, as if, see, and what that means is that the conceptualization of the universe is separate from God. And I think this is the beginning of what I often call God number one and God number two. Because God number one and God number two is a separation of God's transcendence from his immanence. And so God is now out there. And then later when we get to talk with what Brett Sockold was talking about, God then, well, we'll get into what then God becomes when you imagine that. Because this movement is actually a movement towards, in some ways, in some aspects, you're really differentiating what was inherent in the Christian picture, that God and the universe are not synonymous, as in pantheism, that God is not exhausted by everything that's in the universe, which is pantheism, but that the relationship is, well, we're going to get into that relationship. And then, of course, secularism, you have the buffered self, where God is neither transcendent nor immanent, that we are buffered from God. And now you get into deism, the Enlightenment, and science. Well, we know that plague and pestilence are caused by germs and viruses. And it's not so mysterious, although for many of us, without coronavirus tests, it feels mysterious. We have to go on the assumption that we are in some ways infected, but we don't know whether or not we are, because this particular illness, for some people, when they get sick with it, they almost don't even notice because it's so mild. For other people, it's deadly. Oh, that's a really bad thing for something like this, and it's very easily caught. So we know that plague and pestilence is caused by germs and viruses. We can treat them, we can prevent them, we can test for them, we can contain them. This isn't God, but again, when you say it that way, God is like this, that's God number two. God is like this actor. No, because there's this situation that just goes in on its own, completely apart from God, and God is out there. Okay? These are random events. In other words, there's no purpose behind them. Well, actually, random really is not, I've made this point in many videos, random is a very fudgy word, because on one hand, we're making a metaphysical assertion with respect to it, when the word better technically reveals the limits of our ability to track the causes. Because things that had been random before are no longer random now. The word random is really much more of a term about our limits of knowledge than necessarily patterns. Well, this is not a pattern that we can use to predict particular outcomes, so we call it random. Well, that's fine. I'm reading Talib's Fooled by Randomness right now. Very much enjoying that book. I'm sure it'll come into my video soon. So these are random events, and when random gets fudgy, we begin to say, well, this is a religious explanation based on a religious articulation of a particular cosmology. Well, it's the contemporary secular cosmology that says, well, we can't explain the Big Bang. So, in other words, the old saw, give me one miracle and I'll explain the rest. can't explain the Big Bang, but after that, everything unfolded via physics and randomness. There's no reason available to us. There's no purpose in the universe. It's an event in physics without, well, it had a cause. We don't know what caused the cause, but we're not going to ask that question. But there's no purpose or intentionality. Things just happen. But again, this question of divining purposes or intentionality, even in other people, is something that we struggle with, but yet we're very sure about this assertion. Now, older documents like the Heidelberg Catechism, they didn't go with that. Lord's Day 10, question and answer 27 of the Heidelberg Catechism says this: what do you understand by the providence of God? The almighty and ever-present power of God. In other words, God's not separate. God's very related to the universe, and we struggle with how. We're going to talk more about that. By which God upholds as with his hand. In other words, the Heidelberg Catechism often talks about the fact if God were in an analogy to look away from the universe, it would all disappear. That's the perspective of the Catechism. This is before Deism, remember. Heaven and earth and all creatures, which God upholds with his hand, heaven and earth and all creatures, and so rules them, leaf and blade, rain and drought, fruitful and lean years, food and drink, health and sickness, prosperity and poverty. All things, in fact, come to us not by chance. See, this is where it's dealing with this idea of chance, but by his fatherly hand. That makes us really uncomfortable. Why is it we're more emotionally comfortable with the idea of these things coming by chance than by coming by intention of a personal being who knows us personally, and then when bad things come, well, it's really hard not to take it personally. We're going to have to get into that. And I think this is actually behind a lot of what has happened in society. So again, in the secular realm, we have an impersonal universe. No reason for being is available to us. It's an event of physics without cause, without purpose, without intentionality. You can't take anything personally because there's nothing personal to be taken from it, because nothing personal is happening in the whole show. Now, this actually mirrors an ancient perspective of the universe. If you read mythology, if this is from, let's say, Hesiod's, a summary of Hesiod's Theogony, which is the story of where gods come from. Okay, now we talk God, capital G, God, small g. Are Zeus and the Lord the same thing? I was just listening to Joe Rogan. Is God and Woden the same thing? No, not hardly. And we're going to demonstrate that here. Because if you read, again, I've talked about this book a lot, Ezekiel Kaufman, he says the Hebrews had a very different perspective from pretty much everybody else in the world that we know. And we're going to talk about some of the nuance of that. In the beginning, chaos, the nothingness of which the first objects of existence appeared randomly without cause. We can't say why. It's chaos, and then things just appeared, arose spontaneously. The parthenogenic children of chaos were Gaia, the earth, Eros, desire or love, Tartarus, the underworld, Erebus, darkness, and Nyx, night. And out of this, then, suddenly, gods begin to come about. The goddess of love, the goddess of all of these things, and on and on and on. And this pattern you will find commonly in mythology, and it's striking that that's not the pattern you find in the Bible at all. Read Genesis 1. It's a very different story. And there's no story about what God, the Hebrew God, emerged from. So pretty much in every other mythology, there's some meta-divine realm out of which emerges first order gods, and then there'll be second order gods, and we'll work our way all the way down to human beings. That's how mythology works. But the gods are all part of the system. They are bound by the rules of the meta-divine realm. they are bound sometimes by the fates, and see, this is where, so those fates sometimes get conceptualized as gods, and so then you have the question of, well, are they gods within? And you can see ancient people struggling with these very same questions in their system, because they can't help but have these other gods that are sort of powerful. So are the fates gods, or are they impersonal forces, or laws of the meta-divine realm, as we would phrase them? But the power and knowledge of the gods are all limited. And so what you see is that these, in a kind of ancient modern way, these gods emerge from the chaos, from the purposelessness of the meta-divine realm, and then they start doing the kinds of things that gods did. And some gods are better, and some gods are worse. Some gods are more powerful, some gods are less powerful. But they're all parts of the system, subject to the impersonal meta-divine realm. Okay? The Hebrew story is very different. There's not a meta-divine realm. There's God. And in that way, God is sort of parallel to the meta-divine realm, but God's not impersonal, but personal. And it's not subject to the rules of another thing higher than the God. It's God. And creates the world out of his own desire. There's not a God, eros, out of which desire and things like you find in the Greeks. Creates the world out of his own desire and for his own purposes. In other words, purpose and meaning is shot through everything in the world. And again, my favorite verse for pointing to this and this nature of God is in Isaiah chapter 6. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. He's transcendent. He's above. He's not exhausted by creation or contained by creation, but the whole earth is full of his glory. There's nothing you can't touch that doesn't have his fingerprints on it in one way or another. This is the difference between the meta-divine realm and God. We can kind of see them as parallel in that, in some of the functions, but they're not really parallel, because God has within it far more than this impersonal meta-divine realm, out of which emerges gods and things and creation and people and such. Now, one thing was interesting. A few years ago, I was reading Dallas Willard. He was drawing the connection in the divine conspiracy between the words of Jesus in the New Testament and Plato's Republic. So picked up a copy of Plato's Republic in Greek, and I'm just reading along, and I begin to notice that in Plato's Republic, they'll often, like the Greeks, talk about the gods, but every now and then you'll see this in English translations. You'll see God in all caps. And this has been pointed out and not, I don't think, nearly looked at deeply enough, which kind of shocked me from the perspective of Plato's Republic, because, Plato seemed to have this conceptualization of God, which was actually common in the ancient world, and also the gods. And in that way, well, then what does Plato mean by God, capital G? Well, actually, you see this in the Jordan Peterson conversation with Sam Harris, and this is where I got my God number 1 and God number 2. Because God, as an idea, as a conceptualization, is an incredibly useful shorthand that it seems we can't really do without. It's the sum total of what the universe delivers to us. And it's sort of parallel now in post-Christian ways when people talk to universe or the universe or being or something like that. Okay, it's something analogous to that. And Jordan Peterson, when he's talking to Sam Harris, that's where I really saw it, because it was very clear very quickly that Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris were very much talking about two different things, and that's where I got God number 1 and God number 2. So God number 1 from Jordan Peterson is general revelation. It's immanence. It's the sum total of everything that happens to us. It's the frame of frames. Sam Harris is talking about God as agent, God as actor, special revelation, transcendence, a God in the system in some ways, a God who is written into the story. Now, I got into this with my conversation with Brett Sockold on transubstantiation and the search for the substance of God, because actually there's a lot of conversation about this in medieval Christianity and in the church fathers. And part of the reason that the discussion about the Lord's Supper took the kind of turn it did in the West, which arrived at the Protestant Reformation, was these underlying questions of the relationship of God and the universe. And Brett, in his book, Transubstantiation, nicely lays a lot of these things out in terms of why the West has had this big fight with Protestantism and Catholicism and some of the history of that. But you see this because Jordan Peterson is talking about God as useful shorthand, as conceptualization. He's, I'd say, an open agnostic in terms of his metaphysics and his ontology with respect to this God and the agency of this God. But Sam Harris uses this God number 2 and the reduction of it and says, no, that's what we're talking about. Anybody who understands classical literature and listens to Jordan Peterson can recognize what Peterson is doing. And we see this in the God of the Bible. And again, as Kaufman notes, there's no theogony in the Bible. There's no story about how the Lord comes about. The story simply starts with the Lord, period. And of course, when you get to the New Testament, you get Jesus. That's going to cause a lot of turmoil. And don't forget, we started out with the Gospel of John here. In him we live and move and have our being, Paul says, quoting a Stoic. Well, what does that mean? Think about what Paul is saying here. And Paul is appropriating that and saying, yeah, that's pointing to a truth about God. In him we live and have our being. It's God is sort of the arena. With the Vervaeke stuff, I talk about the agent-arena relationship. This is God as arena. This is God number 1. It's the ground of all being. The earth is full of his glory. It's if you ask, again, I've used this illustration before, if you ask Frodo, where's J.R.R. Tolkien, Frodo has a difficult time finding Tolkien in the story of the Lord of the Rings, but yet Tolkien is everywhere in the Lord of the Rings. You can't understand the Lord of the Rings without Tolkien. So there's an analogy that points to the relationship as such. God is so immanent, you can't escape him. And the psalmist thought, if I go to the heavens, you are there. If I go to the depths of Sheol, you are there. I mean, you're there everywhere. We can't get away from you. But yet the Hebrews also talk not only God as arena, but also God as agent, God number 2. God is beyond the created order and also the source of the created order. Holy, holy, holy. It's as holy as you can get. We can't conceive of him, yet we can relate to him through analogies. God is not exhausted by the material order or the physical order or the order that we see. God is also agent. God is both agent and arena. Now, I used an imperfect analogy in a conversation with Nathan on his live stream. He had told me that he'd gotten the virus and I'd met Nathan and done a conversation with him before and wanted to sort of check up on him. So I popped into his stream and everybody wanted to talk about Calvinism. Well, and so I gave some analogies of the game designer designing the game. When I was watching my children play Uncharted, I'm not real good at these kind of computer games because I didn't grow up using those controllers. But I'm watching them navigate. I've tried it and I'm a mess. But I watched them navigate and I very quickly learned that it looks like you can go everywhere and do everything, but you really can't. The game designers have sort of set you on a track. And you have tremendous amount of freedom in there, but the players have, the agency of the players is dependent upon the agency and the freedom of the designer. And the designer has consistency and coherency with respect to what he does with that. But he's also working a narrative. For example, if J.R.R. Tolkien would give Aragorn an F-15, it would break the story. Now, does that mean, well, okay, let's think of J.R.R. Tolkien in World War II. Let's give him a British Spitfire. If, Aragorn would come flying in a British Spitfire, it would break the story. Could Tolkien write Aragorn in a World War II Spitfire into the Lord of the Rings, wasting orcs? Sure. But it would break the story. So the agency of the players is a sub-agency beneath, and this is where the question of God and This is where this stuff gets complicated. The player has contingent freedom, but the game designer has greater freedom, and they're connected, yet they're distinct. It's an imperfect analogy, but I think it highlights some things. And this, I think, can add to and help inform the complexity of the way Jesus talks. Did this man or his parents sin? No. Does it mean they're without sin? No, it's not what he's saying. He's saying you can't draw these lines. You don't have that kind of knowledge. But yet at the same time, he warns the guy in John 5, stop sinning or something worse might happen to you. So there is a connection. Yeah, there is a connection. Can you draw the connection? Maybe not. Well, can you always draw the connection? No. Can you sometimes draw the connection? Yeah. Always and sometimes are not necessarily enemies, but you have to understand them both. Our agency is not in competition with God's, and this is exactly what you will find in historic Christianity. That we can in some ways say, yeah, this COVID-19 is part of the judgment of God. Yes and no. God isn't out of the picture. God isn't a weak character like Zeus or Apollo or another god trying to battle with the fates. No, that's not the picture of God at all in Christianity. It's a totally separate picture. Let's read the story because it's a great story. John 9. As he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Now think about that metaphor. Night is coming, but while I'm in the world, I am the light of the world. Now, as always with these passages, you can pause on any verse and spend hours with them. But for the sake of time, I'm not going to do that, because even reading and interpreting a text is selecting within the text. After saying this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. Go, he told them, wash in the pool of Siloam. Now, this kind of thing often gets attention from people because it's, why did Jesus do it this way? Why? Is that magic? Well, Jesus had his reasons for doing it this way. I think there were communication reasons for why Jesus did it this way, but we see many times when Jesus doesn't hardly say anything and just announces that, and you saw this in John chapter 4, that the royal official's son miles away was healed when Jesus simply declared him healed. So Jesus is not limited to this kind of thing, but Jesus sometimes does this kind of thing. And if you think through what I'm trying to say about God and God's relationship with the world, it makes sense. It makes similar sense to C.S. Lewis's observation about Jesus turning water to wine. C.S. Lewis makes the observation that God turns water to wine every day. Jesus just sped it up in some ways. Jesus did it indirectly, but this is how Jesus and God, C.S. Lewis in his book Miracles will talk about miracles of the old creation, miracles of the new creation, that there's not a break in the created order as deism imagined when Jesus does this. He told him, go wash in the pool of Siloam. This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. Now, if you notice the way Jesus sets this up, and this might be the reason for, using the mud and all of this communicating to the man doesn't know what Jesus looks like. And the man doesn't regain his sight when he's in the presence of Jesus. And you'll find Jesus often using these things for the impact he wants. And if you go and you look at my Sunday school class, you'll see that Jesus is carrying on a very intentional way of communicating himself to the world that has not stopped or been exhausted in the first century. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg? Some claimed that he was. Others said, no, he only looks like him. There's a running question in these stories about who really is blind. For whom is the light on, and who is walking around in darkness? And you might remember a couple of weeks ago, Nicodemus comes at night. The woman at the well comes at midday. The Gospel of John plays with these things. Some claims that others say no, he only looks like him. But he himself insisted, hey, ask me. I'm the same guy. How then were your eyes opened? Because this doesn't happen. He replied, the man they call Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and I could see. Just the facts. Where is this man, they asked. I don't know. Didn't you listen to the story? I had to get my way to the pool, and I washed, and he's not here, so I don't know where he is. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. Bring him to the leaders. Everybody knows it's a miracle. Nobody can cover this thing up. It's already out. Even if people want to cover it up, which is where we'll go to. Now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was the Sabbath. Another layer. Again, see, Jesus keeps doing this on the Sabbath to provoke incidences around himself. Jesus could have done this another day of the week. The guy's always been begging there for years. Jesus picks the fight on the Sabbath intentionally. And again, go see, my Sunday school lessons about this. Therefore the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. He put mud on my eyes, the man replied, and I washed, and now I see. Same story, shorter version. I keep having to tell people the same story. Now, some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God. Now, if you remember Nicodemus thought he was. And so right there you see that the political religious leaders are divided on Jesus. Jesus has caused a division amongst them. This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. Oh, he didn't keep the Sabbath. He did heal the man. Now we have dissonance. We have a theological crisis, and we don't know how to resolve it. So we're going to talk about it with each other. Others said, how can he perform things like this if he's a sinner? So they were divided. Because again, if you look at the difference between the metadivine realm and God, sin is rebellion against God. And so sinners shouldn't be able to do miracles. And they're trying to figure this out. Assumptions of the world, assumption of the world was that God's will is made known by its outcomes. And that's what they're struggling with. And so this question about sinners and gods. Now, this is a very old conversation. And if you read Tom Holland's The Shadow of the Sword, or if you read the book of Job, you'll see that for thousands of years, people have been working on these questions. Because, well, if God is this useful heuristic for everything that comes our way, sort of like we use universe or what have you when we personify it, therefore, it's easy math to read God's mind. If this thing happened, then God is down with it. So God was pro-Holocaust, or God was pro-disease, or God is pro-this. And this lurks behind this question of, is the COVID-19 virus the judgment of God? Well, if it's here now, it must be God's will. But this question about God's will is a really complicated thing. And already, the book of Job, which is a very ancient book, the point of the book of Job is that don't fall for the easy math. But what you'll find is that we keep falling for it. We fall for it in the church. We fall for it outside the church. Pagans fall for it. Everybody falls for the easy math. You can't, and the point of the book of Job, and Jesus' point is, you can't read God's mind just by looking at outcomes. They're also making a similar point. Outcomes also express God's mind. Now, if you think about how human beings relate, it's similar. Ask somebody, why did you do that? They probably can't tell you. Or, think of the rider and the elephant, they'll give you a reason for it. In fact, when they do these split brain things, one side of the brain does one thing and the other side of the brain makes up a story. Okay? Is the story disconnected? Yes and no. So in other words, give up the easy math business about God and outcomes. Jesus is saying no. The book of Job said no. But you can't always give up that. And so, in other words, be very careful with it. And when you do these kinds of judgments, you might be called to account for these kinds of judgments. Let's get back to the story. Then they turned again to the blind man. What have you to say about him? Is it, it was yours, the eyes that were open. So, okay, what are we to think about Jesus? We can't agree. So we asked this man, well, what does he think about Jesus? The man replied, he's a prophet. Well, that's a very reasonable answer, because in order to sort of fit Jesus into the categories, well, prophets are the ones who are special revelations from God, in alignment with God, and sometimes able to do miraculous things like Elijah and Elisha. So he's a prophet like Elijah or Elisha. Okay, it's a reasonable answer. He's been to Sunday school, but it's not the answer the politicians want. They still did not believe that he had been blind, even though all of the evidence says he was, and had received his sight until they sent for his parents. Well, we need facts here. Don't think ancient people didn't understand blindness and facts and all the kinds of data we did. They understood it quite well. So, okay, you say you were born blind. Well, all these other people in the streets saw him every day. We're going to find his parents. So haul the parents in. Is this your son? They asked. Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that he can see now? Get the parents to tell us. Maybe they'll resolve the situation with data and with facts and with reason and with science. We know he's our son, the parents answered, and we know he was born blind. But how he can see now or who opened his eyes, we don't know. We weren't there. Ask him. He's of age. He'll speak for himself. Parents understand the political scene too, and it's like, get us out of this room. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders, who already had decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. They're having a culture war. A lot of people talk about our culture war today as being really something. Well, it was a lot worse in the first century, and everybody understood that you don't want to be a person making political statements or religious statements of certain kind, or you're going to get in trouble and you're going to be ostracized by your community. There's nothing new under the sun. Human beings play these games all the time. That was why his parents said, he's of age, ask him. So, depending on the answers you give, well, this guy likes Trump, so all of his answers are wrong. Well, this guy, politics is now, religion is always. We love to divide on these, and it clouds our thinking. I can't listen to anybody who voted for Trump. I can't listen to someone who says anything against Trump. This is what we do all the time. It makes no sense. I'm a scientist. Well, then you don't say the word Donald Trump, because it'll be a mess. A second time they summoned the man who had been blind. Give glory to God by telling the truth. Oh, okay. They said, we know that this man is a sinner. Oh, in other words, you're going to close your eyes to the evidence. He replied, whether he's a sinner or not, actually, this blind guy, he's really down. Whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. Get used to it, people. You're not going to get beyond the facts. Then they asked him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? He answered, I have already told you and you didn't listen. Why didn't you listen? Because I came to this with my preconceived notions of how it is. Is this the judgment of God? Who sinned? Yes, it's the judgment of God against whatever your list of political enemies is. No, it's not the judgment of God, because God is this kind, nice wallflower and only gives pink unicorns and fairy dust to anyone who's out there. We're front-loading our assumptions and trying to make the facts fit. We always sort of do that, but it's a very dangerous thing. And he says to him, I already told you and you didn't listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Now he's sarcastic. They're not going to like that. Do you want to become his disciple too? I love this guy. They hurled insults at him and said, you are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from. Go back to John 3. What does Nicodemus say? He comes from heaven. What does Jesus say? Born from above. This is what the Gospel of John is trying to argue for. We don't even know where he comes from. The man answered, now that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God doesn't listen to sinners. He listens to the godly people who do his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. This guy is using reason and logic. To this they replied, you are steeped in sin at birth. Karma! How dare you lecture us? And they threw him out. Jesus heard that they had thrown him out. And so he found him. And he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? Now again, this is such classic Jesus. Jesus doesn't, even to this guy, you would think Jesus is going to schmooze him or just be cozy with him. Or Jesus throws a question at him that he just healed him. But Jesus is still challenging him, even such. Do you believe in the Son of Man? It's like, where does this come from? It comes from Daniel 7. Daniel 7, in fact, has this great scene where first 6 chapters of Daniel are all ordeal-based things. And I've talked about this before, and I have a video on this actually on the church channel. All these ordeal-based things about, the will of God can be seen through outcomes. That's like the first 6 chapters. It's not thrown away. But then in chapter 7, Daniel is disturbed, and we kind of get the second half of the story. And there's this scene of these sea monsters coming up out of the sea, out of the chaos. They're emerging just like the gods of the ancient world, and they're crunching up the kingdoms of the world. And these sea monsters are empires. It's like out of something like Pacific Rim. And then the Ancient of Days shows up, and there's no battle scene. It's just boom, done. You'll see this in the book of Revelation. Boom, done. It's like Jesus saying, your son is healed. That fast, the sea monsters are subdued. The Ancient of Days takes his seat. His hair is white as snow. His clothing is white as snow. The hair of his head is white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The courts were open, and the books were seated. Then I continued to watch because of the boastful words that the horn was speaking. The Ancient of Days kind of cuts them down, but doesn't really snuff them out. It's still speaking. The Ancient of Days is patient. He listens. And this is a sign again of God's immense humility, forbearance, and patience, that all the stuff that he doesn't agree with and doesn't approve of, he lets it go. We criticize God for that, but the message of the Bible is always only for a time. I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority, and they were allowed to live a period of time. In my vision I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient Days, as was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will never pass away, and his kingdom is one which will never be destroyed. Do you believe in the Son of Man? Boy, that's a loaded question. Tell me so that I may believe in him. Jesus said, you have seen him. Look at what Jesus claims here. Jesus claims, I am that man in Daniel 7. Now, the Romans, when they hear Son of Man, they don't understand it. A lot of people today, when they hear Son of Man, well, he's a human being. Yeah, he's a human being. But that's why the editors have capital S, capital M, because Jesus is taking this passage and saying, if you want to understand me, here I am. You have seen him you couldn't see before. This is the one that gave you your sight. In fact, he is the one speaking to you. Then the man said, Lord, I believe, and he worshiped him. Jews aren't supposed to do that. And this is why Jesus is God the arena. Can he also be an agent within the arena? Can the agent within the arena have the power of the arena, even being the agent? That's what Christianity says. That's why these questions are complex and nuanced. And Jesus says these things. For judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind. What's Jesus saying? Some Pharisees who heard him say this asked, "What? Are we blind too?" Jesus said, "If you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin." Jesus twists it again. But now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains. So right there, all these assumptions we have, you can't be guilty of something that you do in ignorance. Yeah, Jesus says, yeah, that's true. But he comes in judgment. Now again, if you had read in previous chapters in the book of John, you'll notice in chapter 3:17, he says, I didn't come, for God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, that the world might be saved, but that the world might be saved through him. And in 12:17, I did not come to condemn the world, but to save the world. But yet in 9:38, he says, I came into the world for judgment, to condemn. Same Greek word. The Father has turned all judgment to the Son. So which is it? This is from the commentary from Raymond Brown. If you're looking for a commentary on the Gospel of John, it's a classic. We believe that the translation of Krenan as condemn in these passages, also in 8:26, is a clear justification in contrast with save. Nevertheless, the statement that Jesus did not come to condemn does not exclude the very real judgment that Jesus provokes. What does that mean? In the immediate context of the above statements, we are told that he who refuses to believe in Jesus condemns himself, while he who believes escapes condemnation. The idea in John then seems to be that during his ministry, Jesus is no apocalyptic judge like the one expected at the end of time, yet his presence does cause men to judge themselves. A little bit before, Raymond Brown said, we believe that the translation Krenan to condemn in these passages is clearly justified with contrast with save. Nevertheless, the statement that Jesus did not come to condemn does not exclude the very judgment that Jesus provokes. In the immediate context of the above statements, we are told that he who refuses to believe condemns himself, while he who believes escapes condemnation. The idea in John then seems to be that during his... I read this. This is a bad slide. I'm going to have to make sure this doesn't get into the rough draft. Now, follow the pandemic. Are sin and glory revealed by the pandemic? Tripp just posted this on Twitter. He said, don't forget, police in central China, January 1, arrested 8 people spreading rumors about a local outbreak of an unidentifiable pneumonia. Previous online posts were calling it SARS. Are sins being revealed? Is glory being revealed? Yeah, all the time. And we're going to watch this through the whole thing. There's going to be sin. We're going to be condemned. Our actions are going to be condemned. Our sins are going to be obvious. Glory is going to be revealed. Some people are going to do glorious sacrificial things in this pandemic. And we can't stop playing politics. We can't stop with condemnations. But again, it's very interesting because Mother Jones attacked this particular pastor for what he wrote about this is this judgment of God. Yeah, and he said it's like the judgment we see in the book of Revelation. Yeah, I probably wouldn't have phrased it this way, but it's not a crazy thing. So then Mother Jones finds a theologian more to their liking, and he says this: the problem I have with fundamental evangelicalism is that they put a thick line around the scriptures instead of a dotted line. Oh, okay, you're talking about the Bible. But then what he proceeds to say is something I could agree with as well. Faith is the capacity to live with complexity and uneasy questions. Absolutely. He says when you go too quickly to punishment, you forego too quickly on the grace of God. Absolutely. But again, it's both and. Is this the judgment of God? Yeah. Yes and no. can, like Jesus says at the beginning, you draw an easy line. Was it his fault? What is his sin or his parents? No, neither. But that the glory of God would be revealed. So God is involved, and it's involved with questions of, is this did God cause this or did God permit this? And this was where sort of you get into this first and second order causality. Now, when we get into the question of the nuns, is this something God should have avoided? God should intervene. Again, we're putting in deist language, and in some ways, God in the system. Is this that God, like Apollo or Zeus, will come in and stop things? Well, governments and principalities are leaning in to reduce things, and that's all good, and we should want that. Nuns and impersonal God, well, this is part of a problem for that group too. Well, everything happens for a reason. Okay. What's the reason for this? Well, we don't know the reason. Okay. Somehow you're comfortable saying that, but saying, I don't know the reason God would have this done, you're uncomfortable saying that? Yeah, because again, we're back into this taking things personal space, that if it happens for randomness, and again, randomness is sort of this idea that no one can track it, so then it's an accident, it's impersonal, to not take it personally. We feel better about that in terms of our interpersonal relationships. Is your impersonal meta-divine realm, ancient or modern, better? Is it really better if it happens accidentally or on purpose? Well, it's because I'm nervous about my relationship with the Almighty. Why do you feel better when it's up to me? What does that reveal? Remember, Apocalypse and Revelation is the same word. And Eric Weinstein, I don't mean this in any way as a slight against him, because what he managed to do in that sentence was articulate what I had been seeing others expressing, but I couldn't put it into a nice sentence. If God is a person and not an impersonal meta-divine realm, ancient or modern, Eric's opinion is it's better if there is no God, because if there is a God, you have to worry about what's on his mind. I would rather have power of my own agency and not have to worry about, well, you still have to worry about all the other powers in the world and randomness as you imagine it to be. But Jesus is no coward, and he's not afraid of nuance, but nor does he have patience for the easy math approach. Yep, this happened because of this. Do you know that? Maybe if I had a car accident and I was injured because I didn't wear a seatbelt, well, maybe the sin of not wearing a seatbelt, I can draw that line. It doesn't explain the car accident. We human beings are small, and even when we use the word random, we're basically saying, even though we don't fess up to it, that which is beyond my ability to comprehend or predict. But it's not necessarily unpredictable. I just can't do it. Or maybe we can't do it. But that doesn't mean it's chaotic. Those are all our judgments we bring to it. Like the poor, we'll always have judgments with us. We'll do it to Job. We'll do it across the aisle politically. The truth is, we're very limited in what we can know, and maybe we should acknowledge that. And what's at the heart of this are our trust issues. Because we're so funny on this score. On one hand, we have a need to trust scientists or those in authority, or do the scientists really have your best interest at heart? Look at the trolley car experiment. What if, you're part of the 1 or part of the 5? Is that really going to help? You see, we grab onto these things. Now, Christians say, well, there is one who is good, who is in charge, and then the pandemic comes and our trust issues are triggered. The nasty truth we're desperately trying to avoid is we are fragile, we are vulnerable, we are limited. Not our power, not our knowledge can secure for us what we want and expect for ourselves. We are dependent creatures. And whether that's dependent upon an impersonal meta-divine realm, dependent upon politics, dependent upon a virus, None of us get out of this world alive, and we like to fabricate things that imagine we are in control, and we are not. We have trust issues. That's what's at the heart of our pastoral problems. This commenter who made, I don't know if it's a his or a her, you can never tell with comments, Volvodinia, left a comment on the church channel after last week's sermon. It's been watching my videos for a while. I recognize the comment names. I don't have so many users that I can't recognize users. But then, Cheers, probably a Brit or someone, has already caught the coronavirus. I always feel like Pastor Paul has to match the tone of a chronically ill person. Well, the old saying is, if you're a pastor, if you preach to the suffering, you'll never lack for an audience. As a personal question to the pastor, what is it that God is doing that you are not okay with? I'm not okay with the coronavirus. I want it to go away. Now, maybe I'm subject to all of the panic that's going around, and maybe it's overblown, and maybe a month from now, I'll say, I was such a dupe. I made all those videos. I'll keep them up. Go ahead, call me a dupe. I'm fine with it. I will so happily, a month from now or 2 months from now, when all of the members of Living Stones Church come out of the other side of this alive, I will be thrilled. But if the coronavirus takes the life of one person that I personally know and love, yes, I won't be happy with it. Is God involved? Yes. I look at the death of my sister a little over a year ago. Look at the death of my father. I can look at things in my life. What really bothers me are the things that I know I'm responsible for and the sufferings that they've caused. But yeah, trust issues with God. You think I don't have them? I'm just like the rest of you. I've got them too. Which is why I'm religious. Because what religion is doing is training me to love one another, training me in the school of Jesus, training me to be his disciple, training me to believe, and training me to trust. From a young age, I learned the first question and answer of the Heidelberg Catechism. Is one of the most beautiful things I know. You can find Christian Reformed people all around the United States and Canada with this on their walls. My father has a big one in his study, and when it's time to break up Mom's house, I'm going to take that plaque. And this is what it says. And if you believe it, you can say it with me. It's something that's worth devoting to memory. What is your only comfort in life and in death? That I am not my own. In him we live and move and have our being. That I am not my own, but belong body and soul in life and in death to my faithful Savior Jesus Christ. He has fully paid for all my sins. I don't have to go to the grave worrying about my sins. He's fully paid for all my sins with his precious blood, and has set me free from the tyranny of the devil. The devil can lay no claim on my soul. He also watches over me in such a way that not a hair can fall from my head. Do hairs fall randomly? A lot of hairs have fallen. Without the will of my Father in heaven. Yeah, we're talking about the same thing. In fact, all things must work together for my salvation. Salvation of what? Salvation of everything. Now and in the age to come. Because I belong to him, Christ, by his Holy Spirit, assures me of eternal life. I don't always believe. I've got my own trust issues. I have anxiety. I'm worried. I'm scared. All that stuff happens to me too. It makes me wholeheartedly willing and ready from now on to live for him. That's pretty aspirational some days. I want to read it again through all the way without my little editorial comments. What is your only comfort in death? That I am not my own, but belong, body and soul, in life and in death, to my faithful Savior Jesus Christ. He has fully paid for all my sins with his precious blood, and has set me free from the tyranny of the devil. He also watches over me in such a way that not a hair can fall from my head without the will of my Father in heaven. In fact, all things must work together for my salvation. Because I belong to him, Christ, by his Holy Spirit, assures me of eternal life and makes me wholeheartedly willing and ready from now on to live for him. Virus or no virus, cancer or no cancer, health or bad health, fat years and lean years. In the United States, we've had some fat years. Now we may be in for some lean years. What does the other Lord's Day say? I don't have that one memorized. Almost. The almighty and ever-present power of God, by which God upholds as with his hand heaven and earth and all creatures, and so rules them, leaf and blade, rain and drought, fruitful and lean years, food and drink, health and sickness, prosperity and poverty. All things, in fact, come to us, not by chance, but by his fatherly hand. I should pull up the next question and answer. How does this knowledge of God's creation and providence help us? We can be patient when things go against us, thankful when things go well, and for the future we can have good confidence that our faithful God and Father, that nothing in creation will separate us from his love. For all creatures are so completely in his hand that without his will, they can neither move nor be moved. That's where we are. That's the hope and confidence we have. That's why I'm religious, to deal with my trust issues.